I recognize the senator from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask for unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I was necessarily absent from yesterday evening's vote on cloture on the motion to proceed to S-311, the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. On vote number 27, had I been present, I would have been a yay vote on the motion to invoke cloture. Let me say that a little differently. As I sat waiting for my plane to leave Charleston, South Carolina, to come to the nation's capital, a trip that typically takes about 63 minutes, 3 hours later, I had not yet arrived in Washington, D.C. on a vote that to me should not be a vote at all. This should be common sense, but it certainly was not common sense, so we had to have a vote on an issue that is very near and dear to my heart. I will say without any question, Mr. President, that the frustration that I felt of being late to that vote was one that was incredibly irritating and infuriating, that I had planned to be on the floor of the Senate voting yes on a common sense piece of legislation, the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, but was unable to make it because a 1-hour flight took more than 3 hours, and I arrived here about 4 minutes after the close of the vote, which also is quite frustrating, Mr. President. But what's frustrating even more than that is that in a nation of good conscience, that we would be debating, having a conversation about a child who is born sitting there, alive, separated from her mother, and that there would be a question of whether or not that child should be able to continue to live. This is an issue that has been raised by comments coming out of New York and more recently comments coming out of Virginia when the governor, who happens to be, from my understanding, a pediatric surgeon, suggested that it is okay to allow that child to die. I cannot imagine, whether you are pro-life as I am or pro-choice like others, that this would be even an issue of debate or discussion within the two sides. There is no side on this topic. There cannot be a side about life separated from the mother, whether or not that life should continue to live. This is common sense. This is human decency. This is not an issue of being pro-life or pro-choice. This is being pro-child, which we all should be. And so I find myself at a loss of words, standing on the floor of the United States Senate, where a vote yesterday failed by several votes, having to discuss what doesn't make sense anywhere that I have traveled. And I will tell you, Mr. President, I have recently spoke in Charleston, South Carolina, to a group during Black History where the GOP and African Americans were in the same room having a great conversation about the issues that are important to our nation. We talked about so many of the powerful issues of economic opportunity and opportunity zones. And there may have been some disagreement on whether we should have higher taxes or lower taxes. But there was no disagreement on the issue of infanticide. There was no disagreement whatsoever. So whether you were left in the room or to the right, there was one thing that was in common, was the value of life. Mr. President, when I traveled to Little Rock, Arkansas this weekend to speak to another Black History event where the Republicans and Democrats were coming together at the governor's mansion to have a conversation about moving this nation forward, about the issue of reconciliation. We had conversations in the room about the tragedies in Virginia, from the blackface tragedy to the issues with the 3 ranking members in the Commonwealth of Virginia. When I started talking about the truth of human life, the value and the intrinsic value of each human being, there was 100% support that we are a nation that should always value the life of a born child. There was not a single dissent in a room of nearly 400 people. And to have a debate on the floor of the Senate about something that every American that I've had the conversation with, in airports to events, all agree that there's nothing to debate. And so while I'm saddened and frustrated, I have been encouraged by my fellow Americans from Arkansas to South Carolina to Tennessee, who've all come to the same conclusion, Mr. President, and that is a child born deserves to live. We may disagree on other points, but this is a place of universal agreement from the folks I've talked to. Folks who don't vote for Republicans and folks who don't vote for Democrats, all vote for children. All vote for life. We are a nation that must continue to value life. And for some reason, somehow, this body missed that opportunity to reinforce that value system before the American public, to say to each child born, no matter your state, no matter your challenges, you have intrinsic value. Mr. Chairman, I yield the floor.